The restaurant was an intimate low-lit space, tucked away on a quiet street in the city. The kind of place where conversations are murmured over the clinking of wine glasses. It was our engagement dinner, a formal meeting of two families who were about to be joined by marriage. The air was thick with the rich scent of garlic bread and roasted lamb, interwoven with the delicate perfume of the roses I had sent to the table earlier. Across from me, my fiancée, Olivia, was radiant. The soft candlelight danced in her eyes, and her laughter, a sound I had come to consider the soundtrack of my own happiness, filled the small pocket of space around our table. I looked from her smiling face to my parents, then to hers, a table of contented, hopeful people, and felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. This was it. This was the beginning of my real life. My older brother, Mark, sat to my left. He had always been the center of gravity in our family, the charismatic, successful one whom I had spent most of my life admiring and, if I'm being honest, envying. But tonight, there was no envy. Tonight, I felt like his equal. I had Olivia, a woman I loved with a depth that surprised me, and a future that felt bright and solid. Mark had been unusually quiet all evening, nursing a glass of red wine, his eyes holding a strange, unreadable intensity. I brushed it off as him being tired from work, or perhaps feeling the weight of his best man duties. He was my brother, and despite our rivalries, I believed in my heart that he was happy for me. As the main courses were cleared, my father stood to give the first toast. His words were warm and heartfelt, welcoming Olivia into our family with a genuine affection that made my chest swell with pride. Her father followed, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke of his daughter's happiness. Everything was perfect, a scene ripped from a movie about how life is supposed to go. Friends and other family members offered their own congratulations, each speech layering on another coat of joy and promise to the evening. The atmosphere was one of pure celebration, a bubble of warmth and love, insulated from the cold, indifferent city that bustled on outside the restaurant's windows. Then, it was Mark's turn. He stood up slowly, picking up his glass. A hush fell over the table, everyone eager to hear from the best man, the older brother. He looked across the table, not at me, but at Olivia, his gaze lingering on her for a moment too long. A nervous flutter started in my stomach. "I'd like to make a toast," he began, his voice clear and steady, commanding the attention of the entire room. "To my younger brother, Leo, who has finally found a woman to settle down with. And to Olivia, a woman of decisive action." There was a strange edge to his words, a subtle irony that I didn't understand. He paused, letting the silence stretch, a cruel, theatrical sense of timing he had always possessed. He raised his glass a little higher, a faint, cold smile playing on his lips. I watched him, a knot of dread tightening in my gut, my own smile feeling frozen and unnatural on my face. This was the moment that was supposed to be the pinnacle of a perfect evening, my brother's blessing on my future. Instead, he looked directly at me, his eyes devoid of any warmth, and delivered the line that would shatter everything. "After all," he continued, his voice resonating in the sudden, absolute silence of the room, "she proposed to me first." The only sound that followed was the soft, accidental clink of my mother's fork dropping onto her plate. A tiny, sharp noise that signaled the end of the world as I knew it. The silence that followed my brother's words was not empty. It was a dense, heavy thing, filled with the sudden, violent death of joy. It pressed down on the table, suffocating the laughter and warmth that had existed only moments before. I stared at Mark, my mind refusing to process the sentence he had just uttered. It felt like a line from a different play, spoken on the wrong stage at the wrong time. His face was a mask of calm, cold satisfaction, the face of a man who had just lit a fuse and was waiting patiently for the explosion. Across the table, Olivia's face had drained of all color, leaving her skin a stark, ghostly white against the crimson of her dress. She wouldn't look at me. Her eyes were fixed on the tablecloth, her hands clenched in her lap. Then, the silence broke, and chaos flooded into the void. My father was the first to speak, his voice a low, furious growl. "Mark, what in God's name are you talking about? Sit down." But Mark didn't move. He remained standing, a statue of smug defiance. Olivia's mother let out a small, wounded gasp, reaching a trembling hand across the table towards her daughter. My own mother looked back and forth between her two sons, her face etched with a horrified confusion. The happy, cohesive family dinner had disintegrated into a tableau of shock and betrayal. The air, once filled with celebratory toasts, was now thick with the poison of Mark's revelation, a poison that was spreading. infecting everyone at the table. I felt a roaring in my ears, a physical sensation that drowned out the frantic whispers that had begun to erupt around the table. My reality had been cleaved in two, the world before Mark spoke, and the terrifying, uncertain world after. I tried to catch Olivia's eye, to send her a silent plea for a denial, a shake of the head, anything to tell me this was a cruel, twisted joke. But she remained a statue of shame, her gaze still glued to the table. Her silence was a confession, a confirmation more damning than any words could ever be. The love and trust I had felt for her, so solid and real just moments ago, began to crumble, turning to dust in my hands. The scene became a blur of disconnected moments. I remember my father rising from his chair to physically force Mark to sit. Their argument, a low, vicious murmur. I remember Olivia's father standing up and saying, "I think we should go," his voice tight with a controlled rage directed at my entire family. I watched as he and his wife helped a still silent Olivia from her chair, guiding her away from the table, away from me. She never once looked back. The sight of her walking away, without a word, without a glance, was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs and leaving me gasping. I don't remember deciding to leave. I just remember the feeling of my legs moving, carrying me away from the wreckage of the dinner party. I walked past the other restaurant patrons, who were now openly staring, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. I pushed through the heavy wooden door and stumbled out into the cold night. The city air was damp and smelled of rain, a sudden, chilling shock to my system. I stood on the wet pavement, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows, my heart a hollow, aching void in my chest. The life I had been so certain of, so proud of, had been detonated by my own brother, and I was left standing alone in the rubble. Our apartment, which had always been a sanctuary of warmth and shared dreams, felt like a cold, sterile museum of a life that was no longer mine. I had been sitting on the couch in the dark for hours when I finally heard her key in the lock. Olivia entered cautiously, her movements hesitant and uncertain. In the dim light filtering in from the street, I could see her face was pale and tear-stained. She didn't turn on the lights, accepting the gloom as the appropriate setting for the conversation we were about to have. The silence between us was heavy with unspoken accusations and the sharp, jagged edges of my brother's words. I didn't get up. I just watched her, a stranger in the home we had built together. She began to speak, her voice a fragile, broken whisper that was barely audible in the quiet room. She confirmed it was true. It had happened 3 years ago, more than a year before she and I had even met. She and Mark had a brief, intense, and tumultuous affair that had lasted for a few months. He was older, exciting, and, in her words, emotionally unavailable. She had been in a different place in her life, younger, more insecure, chasing a kind of validation that he was incapable of giving. The relationship had burned hot and fast, and it had ended just as quickly, leaving her feeling hurt and foolish. The proposal, she explained, was a moment of sheer, desperate madness. A few weeks after their affair ended, she had run into him at a bar. She'd had too much to drink and was in a spiral of post-breakup despair. In a misguided, impulsive attempt to prove the seriousness of her feelings, to shock him into taking her back, she had asked him to marry me. It wasn't a real proposal, she insisted, not like the one she had accepted from me. It was a desperate, pathetic plea from a heartbroken girl, which Mark had, of course, coldly rejected on the spot. The humiliation of that moment had been so profound that she had buried it, vowing to never speak of it again. Her justification for not telling me was a litany of shame and fear. "It had nothing to do with you, Leo," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face again. "It was a different lifetime. It was a stupid, embarrassing mistake from a version of me that doesn't even exist anymore. I was so ashamed. I knew how it would sound, and I was terrified it would ruin what we have. Our love, what we built together, is real. That was just a ghost. A stupid ghost from my past. I thought it was buried. I swear I did. I never imagined he would. He would do this." Her words were a desperate attempt to separate her past from our present, to quarantine the poison. But the quarantine had failed. The ghost was no longer a ghost. It was sitting at our engagement dinner, holding a microphone. I listened to her whole story, a cold, sick feeling spreading through me. It wasn't just the fact that she had proposed to my brother. It was the lie of omission. She had allowed me to build a life with her, to integrate our families, all while knowing this colossal secret was lurking in the shadows, a landmine waiting to be stepped on. She had made a choice, every day, to keep me in the dark. The love I felt for her was still there, a deep, aching thrum in my chest. But it was now tangled with a profound, gut-wrenching sense of betrayal. The foundation of trust upon which I had built my entire future had been proven to be sand. The confrontation with Mark was inevitable. I found him the next day at his sleek, minimalist apartment overlooking the city, a place that had always felt more like a showroom than a home. The sky outside was a bleak, unforgiving gray, matching the cold fury that had settled in my heart. He opened the door as if he had been expecting me, his expression not one of apology or regret, but of a weary, self-righteous resolve. There were no pleasantries. The air between us was thick with a lifetime of unspoken rivalry and a fresh, gaping wound. I had come for answers, for an explanation, for anything that could make sense of his monumental cruelty. His justification was as arrogant and twisted as I had feared. He claimed he did it for me. "You deserved to know the truth, Leo," he said, his voice calm and patronizing, as if he were explaining a simple concept to a child. "I couldn't stand by and watch you marry a woman who isn't being honest with you. She has a history, a past that involves me, and you were walking into this marriage completely blind. I did what I did to protect you, to save you from finding out 5, 10 years down the line when it would be even worse." He was painting himself as the noble, protective older brother, the reluctant bearer of a difficult truth. I exploded. The cold fury I had been nursing erupted into a hot, screaming rage. "Protect me," I yelled, my voice echoing in the sterile, empty space of his apartment. "You didn't protect me, Mark. You humiliated me. You humiliated Olivia. You destroyed what should have been one of the happiest nights of our lives, and you did it for an audience. This wasn't about protecting me. This was about you. It has always been about you." The words poured out of me, a torrent of frustration that had been building for years. His constant need to be the center of attention, his subtle ways of undermining my successes, his condescending attitude, it all coalesced into this one catastrophic act of sabotage. The argument stripped away all pretense. It became clear this had nothing to do with Olivia's past and everything to do with my future, my happiness, my engagement, my stepping out of his shadow to build a life of my own. It was something he couldn't tolerate. He saw my joy as a threat to his own position, as the golden child of the family. "Maybe I'm tired of watching you make naive mistakes," he sneered, his mask of nobility finally slipping to reveal the ugly, jealous man beneath. "You've always been too soft, Leo. You needed a wake-up call." It was a stunning admission of his true motive, to assert his dominance, to put me back in my place. I looked at my brother, at the man I had spent my life looking up to, and I felt nothing but a cold, hollow emptiness. The love, the admiration, the deep, familial bond I thought we shared, it was all an illusion. He was not my protector. He was my saboteur. There was nothing left to say. The betrayal was too deep, too calculated, too cruel to ever be repaired. I walked out of his apartment without another word, the sound of the door closing behind me, feeling like a final, definitive end to our brotherhood. I had lost my fiancée and my brother in the space of 24 hours. The days following the two confrontations were a descent into a gray, muted fog. I stayed in the apartment we had shared, but it no longer felt like my own. It was a space haunted by the ghosts of a happy future, every object a painful reminder of the life I had lost. I called Olivia and told her I needed space, that I couldn't think, and she had agreed, her voice small and broken on the other end of the line. I didn't answer calls from my parents, who were undoubtedly trying to mediate a crisis that was beyond repair. The city outside my window, with its relentless energy and noise, felt a million miles away. My world had shrunk to the four walls of my apartment, a self-imposed prison of grief and confusion. It was my best friend, Sam, who finally breached the walls. He didn't call first. He just showed up, using the spare key I had given him years ago. He found me sitting in the dark, surrounded by takeout containers, the air in the apartment stale and heavy. He didn't say much at first. He just opened the windows, letting in the cool evening air and the sounds of the city. He cleaned up the mess, threw out the old food, and put on a pot of coffee. His presence was a quiet, non-judgmental anchor in the swirling chaos of my thoughts. He didn't offer advice or platitudes. He just made it clear, through his actions, that I was not completely alone. Later that evening, sitting in the clean kitchen, I finally told him everything. The words came out in a jumbled, emotional torrent: the dinner, Mark's smugged face, Olivia's confession, The brutal argument with my brother. Sam listened patiently, his expression serious, his gaze never leaving mine. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, processing the sheer scale of the wreckage. Your brother, he said finally, his voice firm, is a piece of work. This has nothing to do with protecting you, Leo. This is about him. He couldn't stand seeing you this happy. Hearing it from an objective outsider, from someone who saw the dynamic clearly, was a powerful validation of my own feelings. The core of my struggle, the obstacle that felt insurmountable, was the dual nature of the betrayal. I was trapped in a vortex of pain, unsure of who had wounded me more deeply. Was it Olivia, for her lie of omission, for building our relationship on a foundation that she knew was flawed? Or was it Mark, for his deliberate, malicious act of cruelty, for using that secret as a weapon to destroy my happiness for his own selfish reasons? My anger and my grief were tangled together, a Gordian knot of emotion that I couldn't begin to unravel. I felt foolish for having trusted both of them so completely. Sam stayed with me for 2 days. A steady, grounding force that kept me from sinking completely. He didn't push me to make any decisions. His support was not about finding solutions. It was about creating a safe space for me to simply fall apart. On the 3rd day, he suggested I get out of the city. You can't think clearly here, he said, gesturing to the apartment, the neighborhood, the city that was now saturated with pain. Go somewhere else. Anywhere. Drive until the view changes. You need to separate yourself from the battlefield to see the whole war. His advice was simple, practical, and it was the first thing that had made any sense to me in days. I took Sam's advice. I packed a small bag, got in my car, and drove north without a destination, leaving the sprawling, wounded city in my rearview mirror. I drove for hours, the urban landscape gradually melting away into rolling hills and wide-open fields, the monotonous rhythm of the highway, the changing scenery, the sheer act of moving forward. It all helped to loosen the tight, suffocating knot of grief in my chest. I ended up in a small, quiet town on the coast, a place where the air smelled of salt and the loudest sound was the crashing of the waves. I rented a small, Spartan room in a motel overlooking the ocean and spent my days walking on the cold, windswept beach. In the solitude of that empty coastline, I finally had the space to think. I began to untangle the mess of my emotions, starting with Olivia. I replayed our entire relationship in my mind, but this time, I tried to look past the shadow of the lie. I remembered the way she looked at me, the easy comfort of our silences, the shared laughter, the genuine kindness she showed me every single day. The love we shared was real. I knew it was a mistake, was born of fear and shame, not malice. It didn't excuse the lie, but it placed it in a human context. She had made a terrible, cowardly decision, but it did not necessarily negate the truth of the love that had grown between us. Then, I turned my thoughts to Mark. This was harder, more painful. I sifted through a lifetime of memories, and with my new, clearer perspective, I began to see a disturbing pattern. The subtle put-downs disguised as jokes, the way he would dominate family gatherings, the times he had given me advice that had subtly undermined my confidence. His actions at the dinner were not an aberration. They were the culmination of a long-standing, toxic dynamic. He had never truly seen me as an equal, only as a supporting character in his own story. This realization was profoundly painful, but it was also liberating. It freed me from the illusion of the brotherhood I thought we had. My personal growth on that lonely beach was about understanding the different textures of betrayal. Olivia's was a betrayal of trust, a failure of courage. Mark's was a betrayal of love, an act of intentional cruelty. I had to decide if either could be forgiven, if either relationship could be salvaged. Forgiveness, I realized, was not about condoning their actions. It was about releasing myself from the prison of my own anger. I had to decide what I was willing to live with, what kind of future I could build, and what foundations were truly non-negotiable. As the week drew to a close, a sense of quiet resolve settled over me. I stood on the beach, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I finally knew what I had to do. The path forward was not easy, but it was clear. It was a path I had to walk for myself, based on my own values and my own hard-won understanding of love, trust, and family. I drove back to the city, not with a healed heart, but with a clear mind, ready to face the wreckage and begin the difficult, necessary work of rebuilding. The first person I met with was Olivia. We met in a neutral space, a quiet park bench on A crisp autumn afternoon. The conversation was not angry or accusatory. It was filled with a profound and aching sadness. I told her that I believed her, that I believed she loved me, and that her mistake came from a place of fear, not malice. I saw the relief flood her eyes, the hope that this meant we could go back to the way things were. But I explained that the issue was no longer just the lie itself, but the context surrounding it. My brother would now forever be a ghost in our story, a permanent fixture in our shared history, and his reasons for doing what he did were tangled up in all of it. I told her I couldn't marry her, not now, and maybe not ever. I explained that the foundation had been too deeply fractured, not just by her lie, but by my brother's cruelty. To build a marriage on that shattered ground felt like a recipe for future failure and resentment. It was the hardest decision of my life, an act of self-preservation that felt like we both cried, mourning the beautiful future we had lost. I told her I needed to heal on my own, and she, in turn, needed to reckon with her past. We left the door open, not to a relationship, but to a distant future where forgiveness might be possible, but the engagement was definitively over. My next conversation was with my parents. I met them at their home and laid out my decision with a calm finality. I told them that my relationship with Mark was, for all intents and purposes, over. I would be civil at mandatory family gatherings for their sake, but the brotherhood we once had was dead, and I would not entertain any attempts to resurrect it. I explained that his actions were not a mistake, but a deliberate act of sabotage, the culmination of a lifetime of toxic behavior. Setting this boundary was a crucial step in my own growth, a declaration that I would no longer allow his narcissism to dictate my emotional well-being. It was a painful, but necessary, amputation. Months have passed since then. I live in a new apartment, in a different part of the city. The healing is slow, a non-linear process of good days and bad. Sam remains my anchor, a constant source of support. I am learning to live with the ghosts of what happened, to accept the scars on my heart. I am focusing on myself, on my work, on rediscovering the person I am outside of the context of those two defining relationships. I am no longer Mark's little brother or Olivia's fiancé. I am just Leo. And while my story is one of heartbreak, it is also one of liberation, of finally stepping out of a long shadow and learning to stand on my own. We all have secrets in our families, unspoken histories that fester in the silence. We all know what it feels like to have our trust broken by the very people who were supposed to protect it. What is the one truth you wish you had the courage to speak at your own family dinner? What is the secret that changed everything for you? Your story deserves to be heard. Share it in the comments below, because in these shared experiences, we find a powerful reminder that we are not alone in our battles. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more real-life narratives, and share this with anyone who might be fighting their own silent war against a family secret.